The autumn of 1876 descended upon the Montana Territory, like a sentence passed by an indifferent judge, cold, final, and without mercy. 6 months had elapsed since the catastrophic defeat of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer at the Little Bighorn and the frontier had transformed into a landscape of seething hatred and retribution. The newspapers arriving from the eastern cities via stagecoach and telegraph carried headlines screaming for vengeance, their black ink forming words that dripped with bloodlust. Savages must be punished, and no quarter for the red devils. The settlers who had pushed westward into these vast territories now looked upon every native face with suspicion and murderous intent, while the indigenous peoples Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and others moved like hunted ghosts through lands that had belonged to their ancestors for countless generations, now carved up by treaties they had never agreed to and could not read. In this crucible of violence and despair, death wore many faces. It came with the crack of rifle fire echoing across empty valleys. It came with the slow wasting of disease, smallpox, cholera, influenza that swept through both settler and native camps with equal cruelty. It came with the brutal cold of mountain winters that could freeze a man solid in his sleep. It came with starvation, with snakebite, with the kick of a startled horse, with the simple miscalculation of distances that left travelers stranded miles from water or shelter. And sometimes death came in the form of rusted iron teeth hidden beneath innocent carpets of fallen pine needles and golden aspen leaves. Lillian Margaret Thornton had discovered this terrible truth in the most visceral way imaginable. And now, as the 37th hour of her ordeal crept toward its conclusion, she had begun to believe that she would die here alone in this forsaken wilderness, with no one to mark her passing, except the ravens that circled overhead, and the wolves whose distant howls carried on the evening wind. The trap that held her was a monstrous thing, a relic from an earlier era of frontier brutality. Its jaws measured nearly 20 inches across, forged from iron that had been hammered and sharpened into cruel tooth-like projections designed to pierce hide and flesh and hold fast against the desperate struggles of bear or elk or mountain lion. The trap's mechanism was brutally simple, a circular plate concealed beneath debris, a powerful spring coiled beneath, and a trigger so sensitive that even the modest weight of a young woman's boot had been sufficient to release its devastating power. When Lillian had stepped upon it blindly, foolishly, her attention focused on what she had believed to be the sound of running water. In the distance, the jaws had snapped shut, with a sound like a pistol shot driving those iron teeth through leather boot, through wool stocking, through the soft flesh of her left ankle, scraping against bone with a sensation so exquisitely terrible that her consciousness had simply fled, unable to process such overwhelming agony. That first moment, that initial explosion of pain, had been almost merciful in its intensity, for it had granted her the blessing of unconsciousness. But consciousness had returned, as it always does, dragging her back from that dark refuge into a world of suffering so complete that it seemed to fill the entire universe. The pain had evolved during those 37 hours, transforming from sharp electrical agony into something deeper and more insidious, a throbbing, pulsing presence that radiated from her trapped ankle up through her calf, her knee, her thigh, settling into her hip and spine, like molten lead poured into her bones. She had tried everything she could imagine to free herself. In those first frantic hours before exhaustion and blood loss had weakened her, she had pulled at the trap's jaws with her bare hands until her palms were torn and bleeding, her fingernails broken, her muscles screaming with effort. The mechanism had not budged even a fraction of an inch. She had searched the ground around her for a branch or stone that might serve as a lever, finding eventually a length of fallen pine branch as thick as her wrist. She had wedged this branch between the trap's jaws and pushed with every ounce of strength she possessed. Pushed until the branch splintered and broke, sending splinters into her hands and face, pushed until she vomited from the pain. and exertion pushed until she collapsed back onto the needle-strewn earth, gasping and sobbing. She had screamed, of course. Screamed until her voice was nothing but a hoarse, rasping croak that emerged from her throat like the call of some dying animal. She had screamed for help, screamed in rage, screamed in despair, screamed simply because the act of screaming was the only way to externalize even a fraction of the agony that consumed her. But the forest had swallowed her screams as completely as it swallowed everything else, the sound of her voice disappearing into the vast indifference of pine and stone, and sky reaching no human ear. The logging camp where she had been staying lay somewhere behind her, 3 miles 510, she could no longer remember with any certainty. The foreman, a weathered man named Harker, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, had warned her explicitly not to wander alone. "This ain't Philadelphia, Miss Thornton." He had said, his voice gentle but firm. "You step wrong out here, you could be dead before sundown, and nobody would even know to come looking for you. The wilderness don't care about your education or your good intentions. It'll kill you just as dead as it would kill anyone else." She should have listened. Dear God, she should have listened. But Lillian had been restless, impatient, driven by a desperation to find her sister Margaret that overrode all reasonable caution. Margaret and her husband, James Pratt, had been living somewhere in this territory, supposedly in a mining camp near the Tobacco Root Mountains. And Lillian had been so close, tantalizingly close, that the thought of waiting even one more week for the supply wagon to arrive had been unbearable. So she had set out alone, following what she believed to be a game trail, telling herself that she would only walk for an hour or two, just to see the lay of the land, just to feel like she was making progress toward her goal, rather than sitting idle in a camp full of rough men whose eyes followed her with expressions she did not care to interpret. And now she was going to die for that impatience. Die alone, die in agony, die without ever seeing Margaret again, without ever explaining why she had fled Philadelphia, without ever receiving forgiveness or understanding or even acknowledgement of the injustice that had driven her to this God-forsaken territory in the first place. The injustice. Even now, dying slowly in a trap. Lillian felt the burn of it, the memory of Dr. Harrison Pike's office, that wood-paneled sanctuary, that smelled of leather and tobacco and carbolic acid, where she had worked as his medical assistant for 2 years, believing herself to be learning a noble profession from a man of science and honor. How naive she had been, how trusting and stupid and blind to the corruption festering beneath that veneer of respectability. She had seen him do it, seen him falsify records, pocket fees, prescribe unnecessary procedures to wealthy patients who trusted him implicitly. And when she had finally gathered the courage to confront him, to threaten exposure, he had looked at her with such cold contempt that it had chilled her to her bones. "My dear Miss Thornton," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension, "who do you think they will believe? A respected physician with 20 years of impeccable service, or a hysterical young woman with delusions of competence?" Within a week, she had been dismissed. Within 2 weeks, every other medical practice in Philadelphia had mysteriously closed its doors to her. Within 3 weeks, her fiancé Thomas Whitmore had broken their engagement. Within a month, her father had died of apoplexy brought on, everyone whispered, by the shame. Within 6 weeks, her mother had retreated into laudanum and silence. Within 2 months, Margaret had married hastily and fled west. And Lillian, with nowhere else to go, had followed. As the second night deepened and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Lillian drifted in and out of fevered consciousness. The cold was simultaneously her enemy and her ally. It intensified her shivering, her teeth chattering so violently that she feared they might crack, but it also numbed the worst of the pain, turning the sharp-edged agony into something duller and more distant. In her delirium, Philadelphia came to her with hallucinatory vividness. She walked again along Chestnut Street on a crisp October afternoon, her arm linked through her sister Margaret's, the two of them laughing at some shared private joke. She saw the brick facade of their family's row house, the one with the dark green door and the brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, the window boxes overflowing with her mother's carefully tended geraniums. She saw her father sitting in his leather armchair beside the fireplace, reading aloud from David Copperfield in his rich, measured voice. The pain in her leg had changed again as the hours accumulated. The initial sharp agony had given way to a deep, throbbing ache, which had in turn evolved into something stranger and more frightening. A numb, distant sensation, punctuated by occasional bursts of pain, so intense they made her gasp and writhe. She knew enough from her medical training to understand what this meant. The flesh was dying. The iron teeth of the trap had severed blood vessels and crushed tissue, and now infection was setting in the bacteria, multiplying in the warm, dark environment of her wound, producing toxins that were spreading through her bloodstream. Even if by some miracle someone found her now, the leg would have to come off. And amputation in the wilderness, without proper instruments or anesthesia or sterile conditions, would almost certainly prove fatal anyway. There was no hope. She knew this with cold, clear certainty. She was going to die here. Lillian closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. She had lost her faith somewhere on the long, brutal journey from Philadelphia to Montana, had shed it like a snake sheds its skin, leaving behind only bitterness and exhaustion. If God existed, he had demonstrated with perfect clarity that he had no interest whatsoever in the fate of Lillian Margaret Thornton. But then, cutting through the fog of pain and fever and resignation, she heard something that did not belong to the forest's natural symphony. Footsteps. Human footsteps, moving with deliberate care through the underbrush, the soft crunch of moccasins on frost-stiffened ground. Lillian's eyes flew open, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest, despite its weakened state. Hope and terror warred within her. Someone was coming. But who she tried to call out to cry for help, but her ruined voice produced only a faint rasping sound. "Please, help, please." The footsteps stopped. Silence descended, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine branches and the harsh sound of Lillian's own breathing. She held herself perfectly still, listening with every fiber of her being. And then, with no more sound than a shadow cast by moonlight, a figure stepped into her field of vision, and Lillian felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. An Indian. He stood perhaps 15 feet away, motionless as a carved statue, observing her with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. He was tall and lean, his body honed by years of physical hardship into something that seemed more elemental than human, all sinew and bone and coiled strength. He wore buckskin trousers decorated with a simple pattern of beadwork, a shirt of faded red cloth, and a heavy blanket woven in geometric patterns draped across his shoulders against the autumn cold. His hair was long and black, hanging loose past his shoulders. His face was all sharp planes and angles, high cheekbones, and a strong jaw, copper skin marked with two thin parallel scars that ran across his left cheekbone like war paint frozen into flesh. He carried a rifle. She recognized it as a Henry repeating rifle held loosely in one hand. Lillian stared at him, unable to move, unable to speak. She had heard all the stories, tales of massacres and torture of women taken captive and subjected to unspeakable horrors. The newspapers had been full of such accounts in the wake of Little Bighorn. But this man did not immediately raise his rifle. He was simply standing there, watching her with those unreadable dark eyes, and in that moment of observation, she sensed something that might have been curiosity or assessment or calculation. He took a step closer, then another, moving with a fluid grace that made no sound at all. Lillian's hand moved instinctively toward the pocket where she had kept her Derringer pistol, but the weapon was gone, lost somewhere during her struggles with the trap. She was completely defenseless, trapped as effectively as any animal in any hunter's snare. The Indian circled slowly, viewing her situation from different angles, his gaze moving from her face to the trap that held her leg, then back to her face again. Up close, she could see more details, the silver pendant hanging on a leather thong around his neck, etched with symbols she did not recognize. The old burn scar on his right hand. The way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he examined the trap and the terrible damage it had done to her leg. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and slightly rough, as though not frequently used. The language was English, heavily accented, but intelligible. How long? The question was so unexpected, so pragmatic, that Lillian blinked in confusion. He was asking how long she had been trapped. Not threatening her, not making demands, simply asking. 2 days. She managed her voice, emerging as barely a whisper. I think 2 days. Maybe less. I lost count. Please, I need help. But he had already set down his rifle and was kneeling beside her, his movements economical and purposeful. He examined the trap closely, his fingers tracing the mechanism, testing the tension of the spring. Then he looked at her leg, really looked at it with the focused attention of someone assessing an injury. And Lillian saw his expression tighten, almost imperceptibly. The flesh around the trap's jaws was grotesquely swollen, discolored purple and red and black, and the smell of infection was unmistakable. The Indian looked up at her face, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes besides that carefully maintained blankness. It might have been concern. It might have been pity. Bad, he said simply. Very bad. Bone break, blood poison. You die soon if stay here. I know, Lillian whispered. Please, can you open it? Can you free me? He was silent for a long moment, studying her face, as though trying to read something written there in a language he did not quite understand. Then he said, I opened trap, it hurt very much. You maybe scream, maybe faint. That is all right. You understand? Lillian nodded, unable to speak, tears already streaming down her face in anticipation of what was coming. The Indian reached down and placed both hands on the trap's jaws. His hands were large and callous, the hands of someone who had worked hard every day of his life. And she could see the scars that marked them, knife cuts, burn marks, the accumulated evidence of survival in a harsh world. He looked at her once more and said quietly, Breathe. Lillian barely had time to draw breath before he pulled. The pain that exploded through her body was beyond anything she had experienced before, beyond anything she had imagined was possible. It was not merely physical, though the physical component was overwhelming, a white-hot agony that radiated from her leg through every nerve in her body, but also somehow existential, a suffering so complete that it seemed to unmake her, to reduce her to nothing but a single point of consciousness, drowning in an ocean of torment. She heard herself screaming, heard the sound tearing from her throat in great ragged gasps, but the scream seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. She felt the iron teeth pulling free of her flesh, felt every millimeter of their withdrawal as they scraped against bone and tore through tissue, and then suddenly the pressure was gone. The terrible vice-like grip released, and she was free. The last thing she felt before the darkness claimed her completely was a pair of strong arms catching her before she could collapse onto the ground, holding her with surprising gentleness as her body went limp and her mind surrendered to blessed unconsciousness. When Lillian woke, she was moving. The sensation was deeply disorienting. She had expected, if she woke at all, to find herself still lying on the forest floor. But instead, she was cradled in someone's arms, held against a chest that rose and fell with steady breathing, wrapped in what felt like a heavy wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and leather and something indefinably foreign. Her head rested against a shoulder, and the rhythm of walking long, loping strides that covered ground quickly, despite the burden being carried, jostled her gently with each step. She opened her eyes slowly, her vision blurry and unfocused, and saw trees sliding past in the fading light of late afternoon or early evening. The sky visible through the pine canopy was the deep purple blue of approaching dusk, with the first stars beginning to appear. She was being carried. The Indian who had freed her from the trap was carrying her through the forest, moving with a pace that seemed tireless, his breathing steady and unlabored despite the weight he bore. Lillian tried to speak, managed only a faint sound. The movement stopped immediately. The Indian looked down at her, and this time she saw something in his face that might have been relief. "You wake?" he said, and there was a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Good. You strong. I think maybe you die. But you strong." Strong. The word seemed absurd given her circumstances, but she understood what he meant. She had survived. That was a kind of strength, she supposed. "Where?" she tried to ask, but her throat was too dry. The Indian seemed to understand anyway. "I take you safe place. Clean water, fire, medicine for leg. You rest, then we see. Then we see." The phrase suggested an uncertain future which was better than no future at all. Lillian closed her eyes again, too exhausted to question further, and allowed herself to drift. When next she fully woke, it was full dark, and she was lying on soft ground, covered with pine boughs and what felt like an animal hide. A small fire crackled nearby, its warmth washing over her like a benediction. She turned her head slowly and saw the Indian sitting cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, his hands busy cutting strips of leather from a larger piece, using a knife that gleamed in the flickering light. He must have sensed her attention, because he looked up and met her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lillian, with great effort, managed to lever herself up onto her elbows so she could look down at her leg. What she saw made her breath catch. Her left boot and stocking had been cut away entirely. Her leg from mid-calf down was still swollen and discolored, marked by deep puncture wounds. But the wounds had been cleaned, the blood and dirt washed away, and some kind of greenish-gray salve had been applied to each puncture, giving off a sharp medicinal smell. The wounds had been bandaged with strips of cloth that looked like they had been cut from the Indian's own shirt. A splint had been fashioned from straight branches and leather strips immobilizing her ankle and lower leg. Someone, this man, this stranger, had performed all of this while she was unconscious. Had cleaned her wounds, applied medicine, created bandages from his own clothing, fashioned a splint. Had cared for her with a skill that spoke of experience and knowledge, and "You did this?" Lillian's voice was still hoarse, but stronger now. "You treated my wounds." He nodded once. "Trap break bone here." He touched his own ankle. "And crack bone here." He moved his hand to his calf. "Much poison and blood from iron and dirt. Need clean, need medicine plant, need keep still so bone heal right." "I don't understand," she said shakily. "Why are you helping me after what happened at Little Bighorn, after everything? I thought you would kill me, or leave me to die." The Indian's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, there was an edge to his voice. "Custer killed women at Washita River 8 winters ago. Killed children. Kill old people who cannot fight. He attacks sleeping village before dawn, shoot people as they run. No mercy, no honor." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Yellow hair got what he earned at greasy grass. But I not Custer. I not kill women for sport. Not kill person already dying when can help instead." The bluntness of it struck Lillian silent. He was right, she knew about the Washita massacre, though the newspapers had described it as a great victory. And she understood now what he was telling her, that he was choosing to be different from those who had shown his people no mercy. "Thank you," Lillian said quietly. "Thank you for saving my life. I am deeply in your debt." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly and returned to his work. After a moment, Lillian asked, "What is your name? I should at least know the name of the man who saved me." He hesitated, then said, "Chaitin, mean falcon in your tongue, of the Lakota people. And you?" "Lillian Margaret Thornton, from Philadelphia, which is very, very far from here." "I know Philadelphia." Chaitin's voice held a note of grim amusement. "White man's big city in East. Many buildings made of stone. Many people living on top of each other like ants. Never see sky proper." Despite everything, Lillian felt something that might have been a smile tug at her lips. "That's actually a fairly accurate description." Chaitin did not smile in return, but something in his eyes softened fractionally. They had names now. They had exchanged words beyond the purely practical. They had acknowledged each other's humanity. Chaitin reached for the battered tin pot that sat at the edge of the fire steam rising from its contents. He poured some of the liquid into a small wooden cup and handed it to her. "Drink," he said simply. "Tea from sage and willow bark. Make pain less, help you sleep, need sleep to heal." Lillian took the cup with trembling hands. The liquid inside was pale amber and smelled of sage and something bitter. She looked at Chaitin's face and saw him watching her steadily, waiting to see if she would trust him. She drank. The tea tasted earthy and bitter, but it was warm, and within minutes she could feel its effects, a gentle loosening of pain's grip, a softness creeping into her consciousness, a sense of her body finally beginning to relax. Chaitin took the empty cup and set it aside. Then he moved around the fire to adjust the blanket more securely around her shoulders. "Sleep now," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we move again. Many miles to cover. Need you strong as possible." "Where are you taking me?" Lillian asked, her words already beginning to slur. Chaitin was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. But just as darkness began to claim her, she heard his voice. "Somewhere safe, away from soldiers, away from people who hurt you." He paused. "My word, I protect you, keep you alive. This I promise." The last thing she was aware of before consciousness fled was the sound of Chaitin's voice speaking softly in his own language, a low rhythmic chant that spoke of protection and healing and safe passage. And for the first time since stepping into that trap, Lillian allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive. The days that followed blurred together into a dreamlike progression of pain and motion and small, unexpected kindnesses. Chaitin moved them steadily north and east, traveling during the cooler parts of the day and stopping to rest when the sun was highest or when Lillian's endurance failed entirely. He never complained about her weakness, never showed impatience, never made her feel like the burden she knew she was. They did not speak much during those first days. Language was a barrier, but so was exhaustion, and so was the sheer foreignness of their situation. Yet slowly, in the spaces between silence, a fragile understanding began to grow. On the third day, when they stopped beside a narrow creek, Chaitin knelt beside Lillian and began to unwrap the bandages on her leg. The wounds needed cleaning again. He explained the salve reapplied. Lillian, who had been dreading this moment, forced herself to watch. The flesh around the puncture wounds was hot and swollen, angry red streaks spreading toward her knee. Chaitin's face tightened when he saw it, and he said something in his own language that Lillian suspected was a curse. He looked up at her, his dark eyes grave. "Infection. Spread fast." He touched the red streaks gently. Must cut. Take poison out. Lillian's stomach clenched. She understood she had seen Dr. Pike perform similar procedures lancing infected wounds to drain the pus. It was brutally painful even with laudanum. Without it, do what you have to, she said, and was proud that her voice remained steady. I trust you. The word surprised them both. Trust. It was not a word Lillian had expected to use with this man. But it was true. In the days since he had freed her, Chayton had proven himself careful, competent, and unexpectedly gentle. Chayton held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once sharp and decisive. He drew his knife and held the blade in the fire until it glowed faintly red. Then he turned back to her. Bite this, he said, offering her a thick strip of leather. Scream if you want. No one here but birds and trees. Lillian took the leather, placed it between her teeth, and gripped the edge of the hide beneath her with both hands. She nodded. Chayton worked quickly and precisely, making 3 clean incisions to drain the worst of the infection. The pain was white-hot and absolute, filling Lillian's entire universe. She bit down on the leather so hard her jaw muscles cramped, and she screamed, muffled, choked screams that seemed to come from someone else. Tears streamed down her face, and her body shook with involuntary convulsions. But she did not pull away, and she did not ask him to stop. When it was over, Chayton cleaned the wounds with creek water and reapplied the green salve, then bound everything with fresh bandages. His hands were steady throughout. But when he finally sat back and looked at her face, she saw something in his expression that might have been respect. You very strong? He said quietly. Strong like warrior. Lillian spat out the leather strip and wiped the tears from her face with a shaking hand. I don't feel strong, she managed. I feel like I've been trampled by a horse. Chayton's lips quirked very slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Horse would be faster. And despite everything, Lillian found herself laughing, a weak, slightly hysterical sound, but genuine. Chayton watched her with an expression of mild surprise, as though he had not quite expected her to have a sense of humor. After that, the silence between them felt different. Less like a wall and more like a shared language of its own. On the 5th day, as they rested in the lee of a limestone outcrop during a cold autumn rain, Chayton told her why he had been in those woods when he found her. Eye hunting, he said, feeding small pieces of dry bark into their carefully sheltered fire. Following elk sign, my band. We move north toward Canadian lands. Game scarce, many hungry. He paused, staring into the flames. Army hunt us now. After Little Bighorn Yellowhair's brothers want revenge. They kill anyone, man, woman, child. Not matter. Just kill. Lillian listened, pulling the wool blanket tighter. The rain drummed steadily on the rock above them. Is your family with them, your band? No family. Chayton's voice went flat empty. Wife dead, smallpox 3 winters ago. Son dead, same sickness. Father dead in war. Mother. He made a gesture that Lillian had learned meant long ago. I hunt alone now. Bring meat to people, but I not stay with them. Better alone. The pain in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. Lillian recognized it because she carried the same pain herself and the specific emptiness left by losing everyone who mattered. They were alike, she realized. 2 people stripped a family of place, of any certain future. 2 survivors clinging to motion because stopping meant facing the full weight of loss. I'm sorry, she said softly. About your wife and son. I lost people too. My father. My fiancé left me. My sister is somewhere in this territory and I don't even know if she's still alive. I came here looking for her and instead I found... She gestured at her ruined leg. This. Chayton looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. Then he said something that surprised her. "Your sister." "What name?" "Margaret. Margaret Pratt. She married a mineralogist named James. They were supposed to be near the Tobacco Root Mountains, but—" "I know this name." Chayton interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "Pratt. White man with yellow hair, yes, woman with dark hair like you. They at mining camp 2 days west of here. I see them 1 moon ago." Lillian's heart lurched. "You saw Margaret? You're certain?" "I see woman. Hear man call her Magritte. They have cabin at edge of camp. Man dig holes in earth, look at rocks." He shrugged. "Many white men dig holes. Look for yellow metal. Make earth sick. Margaret was alive. Margaret was close, only 2 days away." The relief that flooded through Lillian was so intense it left her breathless. She grabbed Chayton's arm without thinking. "Can you take me there? Please, I have to see her. I have to know she's all right." Chayton did not pull away from her grip, but his expression grew troubled. "Mining camp, dangerous. Many white men there. They see Lakota, they shoot. They see white woman with Lakota." He shook his head slowly. "They think I capture you. They hang me. Maybe hurt you too to teach lesson." Lillian's grip loosened, but she did not let go entirely. "Then we'll be careful. We'll wait until dark, or I'll go into camp alone and bring her out. There has to be a way." "Maybe." Chayton looked unconvinced, but after a moment, he nodded. "We try, but not yet. Your leg not strong enough. Need more days. Need walk yourself, not carry." He was right, of course. Lillian could barely stand unassisted, let alone walk rough terrain. But the knowledge that Margaret was close gave her new strength, new purpose. She would heal. She would make herself walk. And then she would find her sister. Over the next days, Lillian's condition slowly improved. The infection receded, leaving behind angry scars, but no longer threatening her life. The bones in her ankle and calf, though broken, were held in place by Chayton's careful splinting and were beginning to knit. The pain, while still present, had become manageable, a constant companion, rather than an overwhelming master. And she began to walk. The first attempts were humiliating. Chayton supported most of her weight as she tried to put pressure on her left leg, and even those few tentative steps left her gasping and sweating with effort. But she persisted, and each day she managed a little more. First 10 steps, then 20, then 50. Chayton fashioned a walking stick for her, a sturdy length of pine smoothed and shaped to fit her grip, and with this support she could limp along for increasing distances. They talked more as they traveled. Chayton's English improved with practice, becoming less halting and more fluid. He told her about his childhood, about learning to hunt from his father, about the old days before the treaties and the reservations when his people had followed the buffalo herds and lived according to the rhythms of the seasons. He spoke of these things without nostalgia or bitterness, simply as facts, as memories of a world that no longer existed. Lillian in turn told him about Philadelphia, about her work with Dr. Pike, about the scandal and betrayal that had driven her west. She found herself able to speak of these things more honestly than she had expected, perhaps, because Chayton listened without judgment, without the complicated social calculations that governed every conversation in her former world. This Pike man. Bad medicine. Chayton said when she finished. You're right to fight him. Better to have honor and be poor than to have gold and be hollow inside. It was, Lillian thought, the most profound thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. On the 12th day after Chayton had found her in the trap, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley where smoke rose from a scattering of rough buildings. The mining camp. Even from this distance, Lillian could see the ugly scars the miners had left, the tailings, piles, the sluice boxes, the muddy trenches where they had torn into the earth. There, Chayton said, pointing to a small cabin set slightly apart from the main camp. That where I see Pratt woman. Lillian's heart hammered. After all this time, Margaret was down there. She wanted to run down the slope immediately, but Chayton's hand on her shoulder held her back. "Wait," he said firmly. "Watch first. Make sure safe." They waited as the afternoon light faded into evening, watching the camp from concealment. Miners returned from their claims, moving between buildings. Lamps were lit. Smoke rose from chimneys. And then, as darkness fell, Lillian saw a figure emerge from the small cabin, a woman dark-haired and slender, carrying a water bucket. "Margaret," Lillian breathed. "You go now," Chayton said. "I wait here. You bring sister, come back quick, before men see." But Lillian hesitated. The thought of leaving Chayton, even temporarily, filled her with unexpected anxiety. Over the past 12 days, he had become her entire world. She trusted him more than she had ever trusted anyone from her old life. "Come with me," she said impulsively. "Please, I want Margaret to meet you. I want her to know what you did for me." Chayton shook his head slowly. "Too dangerous. White men see Indian, they shoot first. Then we'll tell them the truth. We'll make them understand. Truth not matter to men like that." There was no anger in his voice, only weary certainty. "You know this. You tell truth in Philadelphia, and they call you liar. World not want truth. World want easy story." He was right, and Lillian hated that he was right. But she could not simply walk away from him. "Then I'm not going down there alone," she said firmly. "Not tonight. We'll wait. We'll find another way, a safer way." Chayton studied her face in the darkness. Then very quietly, he asked, "Why you care what happened to me? I am Lakota, enemy of your people. When you go to sister, you be safe. Be with your own kind again. You not need me anymore." Why did she care? That the easy answer was gratitude. But Lillian knew this feeling was something deeper. Over the past 12 days, something had shifted. He was no longer simply her rescuer. He was what friend seemed inadequate. But there was something else too, something she had been trying not to examine too closely, because it was complicated and dangerous, made no sense by the rules of the world she had been born into. When Chayton steadied her as she walked, when his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary on her shoulder, when his eyes met hers across the fire, there was something there that went beyond gratitude or friendship. "You're not my enemy," Lillian said finally, meeting his gaze. "You're the only person in this entire territory who has treated me with kindness and honesty. You're—" She hesitated, then finished simply, "You matter to me, and I won't leave you to face danger alone. Not after you didn't leave me." The silence that followed was profound. Chayton looked at her for a long moment, and in his dark eyes she saw surprise, confusion, and something else, something warm and cautious and deeply vulnerable. Then slowly he reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was rough-scarred from years of work and war, but his grip was gentle. "Then we both fools," he said quietly. "But maybe that is all right. Maybe world need more fools." They stayed on that ridge through the night, keeping watch over the camp below. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the temperature dropped, Chayton shared his single blanket with Lillian, wrapping it around both their shoulders, and they sat close together for warmth and for comfort. And neither of them spoke of how right it felt or how impossible. The next morning brought disaster. They had planned to approach the camp carefully, to wait until most of the miners had left for their claims. But as dawn broke, they saw riders approaching from the south, a full cavalry patrol, at least 20 men on horseback, wearing the dark blue uniforms that had become synonymous with death and deportation for every native person in the territory. "Soldiers," Chayton said, his voice gone hard. "Come looking, hunting my people." "You weren't at Little Bighorn," Lillian protested. "You told me you weren't with Sitting Bull's people." "You think they care?" Chayton was already moving, gathering their few possessions with swift efficiency. "They see Lakota man, they take him. Hang him or shoot him or send to reservation prison. Same as death." Fear coiled in Lillian's stomach. "Then we run, now, before they see us." But it was already too late. The officer leading the patrol, she could see the insignia, even from this distance. A colonel's eagles had turned his horse toward their ridge. He had seen them or seen the smoke from their morning fire, and now he was pointing barking orders to his men. The cavalry spurred their horses into a canter, riding straight for them. "Go!" Chayton shoved Lillian toward the tree line. "Run to camp. Find sister. I lead them away." "I'm not leaving you." Lillian grabbed his arm, her bad legs screaming in protest. "We go together, or not at all." Chayton looked at her, and in his face she saw a war between self-preservation and something else, a fierce, impossible hope that maybe they could both survive this. Then he made his decision. "Then we not run. We face them." He took her hand firmly in his. "You tell them I rescue you, not capture. You tell them I save your life. Make them understand." "They won't believe me." "Maybe, maybe not. But we try." It was insane. It was suicidal. But as she looked into Chayton's eyes and saw the quiet determination there, she understood that this was his way of fighting. Not with rifle or knife, but with defiant honesty. And if he was willing to risk everything on the slim chance that the truth might matter, then she would stand beside him. Together, hands clasped, they walked down the ridge toward the approaching soldiers. The colonel who commanded the patrol was a man named Fitzwilliam Lean, and hawk-faced with cold blue eyes that had seen too much hard service. He reined in his horse 10 yards from where Chayton and Lillian stood, his hand resting on the revolver at his belt, and stared at them with undisguised contempt. "Miss, are you all right?" Fitzwilliam addressed Lillian, ignoring Chayton entirely. "Has this savage harmed you?" "No." Lillian stepped forward, still holding Chayton's hand, feeling the tension in his body. "This man saved my life. I was caught in a trap dying, and he freed me and cared for my wounds. Without him, I would be dead." Fitzwilliam's eyes flicked from their joined hands to Lillian's face, and his expression hardened. "Miss, if he has threatened you, forced you to say these things..." "No one has forced me." Lillian's voice rose sharp with frustration. "I'm telling you the truth. This man is a healer, not a killer. He has shown me nothing but kindness." "He's Lakota," Fitzwilliam said flatly, as though this single fact negated everything else. "He may have been at Little Bighorn, may have killed American soldiers. We're authorized to detain any hostiles found off the reservation." "He wasn't at Little Bighorn. He had nothing to do with Custer's death." Lillian felt Chayton's hand tighten around hers, a warning, a plea for calm. You can't just arrest someone because of what he might have done, because of who his people are. "Miss Thornton." Fitzwilliam's voice took on a tone of forced patience. "I understand you've been through an ordeal. Sometimes captives develop sympathies for their captors. It's not uncommon. But you need to step away from that Indian right now so we can do our job." The words hit Lillian like a slap. Sympathies for her captors. As though her judgment, her sense of truth, her very sanity could be dismissed so easily. As though the 12 days she had spent with Chayton, the pain they had shared, the conversations, the slowly growing trust, were nothing but a fever dream. She thought of Dr. Pike, who had dismissed her accusations with the same condescending patience. She thought of Thomas Whitmore, who had explained so reasonably why he could not marry a woman tainted by scandal. She thought of all the men in her life who had smiled and patronized and explained why her version of reality could not possibly be accurate. And something inside her, something that had been bent and battered, but never quite broken, finally snapped into a new shape, harder, fiercer, uncompromising. "No," she said clearly. Fitzwilliam blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no. I will not step away from him. I will not let you take him. And if you try, you'll have to go through me first." The soldiers exchanged glances. Fitzwilliam's face flushed with anger. "Miss Thornton, you are interfering with military operations. I could have you arrested for—" "Then arrest me." Lillian lifted her chin. "Arrest me for telling the truth. Arrest me for standing by someone who showed me mercy when he had every reason not to. But I will not let you take him, not without a fight." Beside her, Chayton was utterly still. She could feel him looking at her, could sense his shock and something else, pride perhaps, or wonder. But he did not speak. He simply stood there, trusting her to fight this battle with words. The standoff might have ended very badly. But then a voice called out from the direction of the mining camp, "Colonel Fitzwilliam, Colonel." A man was hurrying toward them, tall, thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles and thinning blonde hair. Behind him, a woman in a faded calico dress was running, and Lillian's breath caught because it was Margaret. It was her sister, James. Margaret reached them first, breathless and wild-eyed, and she stopped dead when she saw Lillian. "My God. Lillian, is that you?" "Maggie." The childhood nickname came out choked. "It's me." Margaret rushed forward and threw her arms around Lillian with such force that they both nearly fell. Lillian clung to her sister, feeling Margaret's shoulders shake with sobs, and her own tears came at last, hot and relieving. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret kept one hand on Lillian's arm, as though afraid she would vanish. "We heard you were coming west, but then nothing. No word. I thought you were dead." She looked past Lillian to Chayton, confusion crossing her face. "Who is this? What happened to you?" Lillian took a shaky breath. "This is Chayton. He saved my life, and Colonel Fitzwilliam wants to arrest him for the crime of being Lakota." Margaret's husband, James Pratt, had reached them now. He was a serious-looking man who carried himself with the careful authority of an academic. He glanced from the soldiers to Chayton, to his wife, assessing the situation with quick intelligence. "Colonel Fitzwilliam," he said carefully, "I am James Pratt, mineralogist, under contract with the U.S. Geological Survey. This is my wife, Margaret, and this appears to be her sister, whom we believed lost. Before you proceed with any arrests, perhaps we could discuss the situation somewhere less public." Fitzwilliam looked like he wanted to refuse, but Pratt's invocation of the Geological Survey, a federal agency, had given him pause, and Margaret was already talking. "Lillian is my sister, my only family. If she says this man helped her, then he helped her. If she's standing by him, then so am I. And if you arrest him, Colonel, then you arrest both of us. And then you'll have to explain to your superiors why you detained the sister-in-law of a federal surveyor." It was a bluff, but a good one. Fitzwilliam stared at the three women and the man standing between them and Chayton, and something in his face shifted. Not agreement, but a recognition that this had become too complicated. 24 hours, he said finally. "You have 24 hours to sort this out. After that, my orders stand. Any hostiles found off reservation are to be detained." He turned his horse sharply. "We'll be watching." The cavalry rode back toward the main trail, leaving dust hanging in the morning air. James Pratt's cabin was small but felt like a palace. Margaret fussed over Lillian heating water, preparing tea, exclaiming over her injuries. James himself was quieter, but Lillian could feel his sharp eyes assessing everything. Chayton stood near the door, declining Margaret's invitation to sit, his posture alert. He looked profoundly out of place among the cabin's furnishings. But when Lillian glanced at him, he met her eyes briefly, and the connection between them held steady. "Tell us everything," Margaret said, pressing a tin cup of tea into Lillian's hands. Lillian told the story, starting with her arrival in Montana and ending with Fitzwilliam's ultimatum. She omitted nothing, not her own foolishness, not the horror of the trap, not the days of fever and pain, and certainly not Chayton's skill and compassion. When she finished, Margaret was crying again, and even James looked shaken. "You could have died," Margaret whispered. "I know." Lillian reached out and took her sister's hand. "But I didn't, because of him." She nodded toward Chayton. James cleared his throat. "Mr. Chayton, we are in your debt. If there's anything we can do to repay you, keep her safe." Chayton's English was clearer now. "That is enough. I go now. Soldiers not take me if I not here." "No." Lillian set down her tea hard. "You can't just leave. They'll hunt you. And even if you get away, you'll be alone again and—" She stopped, unable to articulate the tangle of emotions. "I am always alone," Chayton said quietly. "Better that way. Safer." "It's not better." Lillian stood wincing. "And it's not safer, not with the army scouring every valley. You said it yourself, they'll shoot first and ask questions later." "Then what you want me do?" For the first time, Chayton's calm facade cracked slightly. "Stay, let soldiers come, put you and sister in danger." "There might be another option," James said slowly. All three of them turned to look at him. He adjusted his spectacles. "It's unconventional, but given the circumstances—" "Marriage." The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Lillian felt her face flush hot, then cold. Margaret made a small, startled sound. Chayton's expression went utterly blank. "Hear me out," James continued. If Chayton were married to a white woman, to Lillian specifically, the army would have a harder time simply arresting him. He'd be a civilian, a husband protected by law. It wouldn't guarantee safety, but it would buy time and it would provide legal cover. "That's insane," Margaret said faintly. "James, they barely know each other." "The social implications are that Lillian would be alive," James said flatly. "Which she wouldn't be without Chayton. And as for barely knowing each other, Lillian, you've spent 12 days in the wilderness with this man. You've trusted him with your life. I'd wager you know him better than most couples know each other before marriage." Lillian could not speak. Her mind was reeling. Marriage. To Chayton, it was impossible. It was illegal in some territories. It would make her an outcast, a scandal worse than Philadelphia. Her mother would disown her if she hadn't already. But she did know Chayton. She knew his competence and his kindness. She knew the way he moved through the world with quiet dignity despite having lost everything. She knew the sound of his voice in the darkness, the steadiness of his hands, the rare warmth of his almost smile. She knew that when he had asked why she cared, her answer had been true. He mattered to her. And if she was honest, brutally, terrifyingly honest, when he took her hand, when his shoulder supported her weight, when he looked at her with those dark, thoughtful eyes, she felt something. Something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the simple fact that he was a good man. And she was drawn to him. "Lillian." Margaret's voice was gentle. "You don't have to do this. We'll find another way." "There is no other way." Lillian spoke without taking her eyes off Chayton. James is right. And besides, I don't want him to leave. I don't want to lose him. And if this is what it takes to keep him safe, then I would be honored to call him my husband. Chayton had not moved. Now he stepped forward, closing the distance, until he stood directly in front of her. He searched her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. You know what this means? He asked, his voice low and rough. White people hate you, maybe hurt you. Your life be harder, not easier. I know. Your people say I'm savage. Say I am enemy. I know. And still you want this. Lillian reached up and placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I want you to be safe, she said clearly. And I want to stay with you. If that means standing against the whole world, then so be it. I've already lost everything I thought I wanted. Let me choose what I actually want for once. Something profound shifted in Chayton's eyes. He covered her hand with his own. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that only she could hear. Then we are bound, you and me, in this life and beyond. James rode hard to bring back Father Dornan, the priest, from the old Jesuit mission 5 miles east. The priest was a white-haired man with kind eyes and a face weathered by decades in Montana. He listened to James's explanation, looked at Chayton and Lillian, standing side by side, and said simply, God's love knows no boundaries of blood or nation. If you two wish to be wed, I will perform the sacrament. The ceremony was brief. They had no rings, so Chayton removed the beaded belt he wore and wrapped it around Lillian's wrist like a bracelet. The beads were bone and turquoise, and the pattern was his family's mark, something he would have given to his son if his son had lived. Now it was hers. Lillian had nothing to give except her word, which she gave clearly. I take you as my husband. I will stand by you, defend you, honor you, for as long as I live. Father Dornan spoke the ritual words, invoking blessings. James and Margaret stood witness. And when the priest finally said, You may seal your vows, Chayton leaned down and kissed Lillian with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. We married now, he said wonderingly. You my wife, I your husband. Yes, Lillian whispered. Yes, we are. But their moment of peace was short-lived. Within an hour, smoke began rising from the hillside above the camp. Within 2 hours, flames were visible, leaping from structure to structure as men ran with buckets and blankets, shouting in panic. Fire, James said, his voice tight. The camp's on fire. They burst out of the cabin into chaos. Half the mining camp was ablaze. Through the smoke, Lillian could see mounted figures, Fitzwilliam's men, riding slowly through the camp, torches in hand. They're burning us out, James said in disbelief. Destroying the whole camp to get to you. Then we leave. Chayton was already moving, gathering supplies. Now, before they circle around. Wait. Margaret grabbed Lillian's arm. You can't run. Where will you go? Same way we survived last 12 days, Lillian said, surprised by her own calmness. We move, we adapt, we live. Take this. James thrust a leather bag into Lillian's hands. It clinked with coins. Everything we have. And take the mare, she's in the lean-to. She's old but steady. There was no time for longer goodbyes. Lillian embraced Margaret fiercely, feeling her sister's tears, whispering promises to right to survive, to somehow make this work. Then Chayton was pulling her away toward the lean-to, where James's mare stamped nervously. They rode double, Lillian in front, and Chayton behind, his arms around her, as he guided the horse north into the darkness. Behind them, the mining camp continued to burn, and the shouts faded gradually into the sound of hoofbeats and the mare's labored breathing. They rode through the night and into the next day, pushing the mare hard, stopping only briefly to let her rest and drink. Chayton navigated by instinct and by the sun leading them through valleys and over ridges that seemed to have no trail at all. Twice they heard distant riders, and twice Chayton led them into thick timber where horses could not easily follow. By the second night, Lillian was swaying in the saddle with exhaustion, her wounded leg throbbing. But she did not complain. Chayton was even more exhausted, staying awake to watch for pursuit to choose their route to keep them alive. When they finally stopped to rest, it was in a shallow cave cut into a limestone cliff hidden behind juniper branches. Chayton built a tiny smokeless fire, and they ate the last of the bread and dried meat James had packed. Then they lay down together on the stone floor, sharing Chayton's blanket, and Lillian fell asleep with her head on his shoulder and his hand resting gently on her back. Over the next week, they traveled slowly north. The mare went lame on the third day, stepping wrong on rocky descent, and they were forced to abandon her, continuing on foot. Lillian's leg worsened, the long days of walking breaking open barely healed wounds. But she did not ask to stop, and Chayton did not offer. They both understood that stopping meant dying. They spoke little during those days. They had moved beyond the need for words. They communicated through gestures and glances, through the way Chayton adjusted his pace to match Lillian's limping gait, through the way Lillian kept watch while he slept. They had become a single unit, two people functioning as one, bound together by necessity and by something deeper, a recognition of souls. On the 8th day after leaving the mining camp, they came over a rise and saw in the valley below a sight that made Lillian's heart sink. Soldiers. An entire cavalry company, at least 40 men, camped beside a river ford. And beyond the river, another 2 days' travel at most, was the border with Canada. Freedom, safety. But there was no way across except through that ford, and no way through the ford except past the soldiers. We wait, Chayton decided. Wait for night. Cross in darkness. They'll have sentries. I know. His face was grim. But we have no choice. We cross tonight or we turn back. Better to try. They spent the day hidden in cottonwoods watching the soldiers. Lillian saw Fitzwilliam among them, his distinctive hawk face visible even at distance, and felt cold hatred settle in her chest. This man had burned an entire camp, endangered dozens of people, all because he could not accept the idea of a white woman choosing an Indian husband. As twilight fell, Chayton checked his rifle, 8 bullets remaining, and then took Lillian's hands in his. If we separated, he said quietly, soldiers maybe follow me. Let you cross safe. You tell them I capture you again. They believe that. No. Lillian's voice was flat. We've had this conversation. We stay together. You not understand? I understand perfectly. Lillian leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. You are my husband. I stood before a priest and God and made a vow. I don't break my vows. We cross together or we die together, but I will not abandon you. That's not who I am anymore. Chayton closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were bright with emotion. You make me believe. Believe that maybe world can be different. Better. It can be, Lillian whispered. We just have to survive long enough to see it. They waited until full dark, until the soldiers' fires had burned to coals. Then, moving like shadows, they began their approach to the river. The ford was perhaps 60 yards wide, the water running fast and dark over rounded stones. Sentries patrolled both banks. Lillian counted 4. There was no way to cross without being seen. They would have to move fast and pray the darkness covered them. They were halfway across the icy water up to Lillian's knees when a shout rang out. Halt! Who goes there? Run! Chayton said and shoved Lillian forward. She ran splashing through shallows, her bad legs screaming water, soaking her skirt and dragging at her. Behind her, she heard more shouts, heard Chayton's rifle fire. Once, twice heard the crack of return fire and the whistle of bullets passing close. She did not look back. She focused on the far bank on the dark line of trees, and she ran with everything she had left. Her foot caught on a submerged stone, and she fell hard, going under the water shockingly cold. Hands grabbed her, Chayton's hands, hauling her up, pushing her toward the bank. She scrambled up the muddy slope, reached the trees, and turned to help Chayton, and saw him fall. He went down in the shallows, one hand pressed to his side, his face twisted with pain. Blood black in the moonlight spread across his shirt. A bullet had found him. Lillian did not think. She plunged back into the river, grabbed Chayton under the arms, and dragged him with strength she did not know she possessed. He tried to protest, to tell her to leave him, but she ignored him, pulling him inch by inch through the water and up the bank, her vision narrowing to a single point: survive. Get him to cover. Survive. Bullets churned the water. Torches were being lit in the camp. But Lillian kept moving, kept dragging Chayton until they were deep enough into the trees that darkness swallowed them. She collapsed beside him, panting, her hands shaking as she pressed them to the wound in his side. Blood pulsed between her fingers, hot and insistent. Too much blood. Go, Chayton gasped. Leave me. Cross border. Be safe. Shut up, Lillian said fiercely. Just shut up and let me think. But there was no time. Torchlight was moving through the trees, coming closer. And Chayton's blood kept flowing, kept draining away his life. She bent over him, her tears mixing with river water. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. No. Chayton's hand found hers, gripped it with surprising strength. You give me gift. Give me hope. Give me... He coughed and blood flecked his lips. Give me reason to believe world can be good. That is enough. That is everything. Lillian wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness. But there was no time for rage. There was only this moment and the decision she had to make. She could stay and die with him, or she could do what Chayton was asking: run, survive, cross into Canada, and carry with her the knowledge of who he had been, what they had shared. She could live, and by living prove that their impossible love had mattered. It was the hardest choice she had ever made. Lillian leaned down and kissed Chayton one last time, tasting blood and tears and salt. I love you, she said, the words finally spoken. I love you, and I will never forget you. I swear it. Chayton smiled, a real smile full of warmth and peace. I know. I love you too. Always. Then he pushed her away toward the north, toward Canada, toward life. And Lillian, with every fiber of her being screaming in protest, ran. She did not see what happened next, how Chayton, left alone, dragged himself upright against a tree, how he checked his rifle, 3 bullets left, and waited. How when Fitzwilliam's men came, he shot 2 of them cleanly before the 3rd bullet he used on himself, choosing freedom in death over captivity in life. Lillian only knew that she ran through the forest with no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the soldiers, between herself and the place where she had left the man she loved to die so that she could live. She ran until her lungs burned and her leg gave out, collapsing her onto the ground. She lay there sobbing, her body shaking with grief, so profound it felt physical. She wanted to go back, wanted to die with him, wanted anything except this hollow, aching survival that felt like betrayal. But she had made a promise. And Lillian Thornton did not break her promises. She forced herself to stand. Forced herself to keep moving north, using stars to navigate, limping through darkness, with tears streaming down her face, and Chayton's name, a silent prayer on her lips. She walked through that night and into the next day. She drank from streams. She ate nothing because there was nothing to eat. She simply walked one step after another, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the enormity of what she had lost. On the afternoon of the second day, she crossed a small wooden bridge over a creek and saw on the far side a weathered post with words carved into it, "Canadian Territory." She had made it. Against all odds, she had survived. Lillian sank to her knees in the middle of that bridge and wept for Chayton, for herself, for the brief, bright hope they had shared, and the future stolen from them. She wept until she had no tears left, until she was empty and hollowed out. Eventually, a farmer and his wife found her there. They were French Canadians, kind-faced and worried, and they helped her to their homestead and fed her soup and put her to bed. They asked no questions. Lillian stayed with the French-Canadian family for 3 weeks, recovering her strength. When she could walk again, still limping but functional, she thanked them and moved to Fort Macleod, where she found work as a nurse in a clinic run by a Scottish doctor named Angus McTavish. She worked hard. She learned. And slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild some semblance of a life. But she did not forget. Every night she touched the beaded bracelet on her wrist, Chayton's family mark, and remembered. Remembered his hands, his voice, the way he had looked at her, like she was worth saving. She wrote to Margaret explaining that she had made it to Canada, that she was safe, and that Chayton was gone. Margaret wrote back 3 months later, her letter full of grief and relief. She also enclosed a newspaper clipping, a brief notice about an incident at a river ford where an Indian man had been killed resisting arrest after attacking a cavalry patrol. The article called Chayton a hostile and a kidnapper twisting truth into comfortable lie. Lillian burned the clipping and wrote the truth instead. The whole story, everything that had happened. She wrote it longhand, filling page after page. When finished, she had a manuscript of nearly 80 pages. She titled it simply, "The Trapped Girl and the Warrior," a true account, and sent it to every newspaper and magazine editor she could find. Most rejected it. But one, the editor of a small progressive magazine in Toronto called The Canadian Voice, read her manuscript and wrote back, "Miss Thornton, your story is extraordinary. I want to publish it. But I must warn you that it will make you controversial. Are you prepared for that?" Lillian wrote back immediately, "Publish it. I don't care who it offends. The truth deserves to be told." And so it was published in serialized installments over 6 months, and Lillian's story, Chayton's story, their story, went out into the world. It sparked debates in churches and saloons, in parlors and legislative chambers. Some called Lillian a fool and a liar. Some called her brave. Some called her a traitor. Some called her a witness to truth. Lillian ignored all of it. She continued her work at Dr. McTavish's clinic, treating patients and teaching younger nurses living a quiet life in a foreign country. She never remarried. When people asked why, she simply touched the bracelet on her wrist and said, "I already have a husband." But one person who did not ignore Lillian's published account was her older brother, Dr. John Thornton, a surgeon in Boston, who had maintained his distance during the Philadelphia scandal, protecting his own reputation. When he read his sister's story, truly read it with a physician's eye for detail and truth, he was struck by 2 things: the medical accuracy of her descriptions, which no layperson could have fabricated, and the profound injustice of what had been done to both his sister and to Chayton. John began his own investigation. He used his medical connections to obtain records from the Army's Quartermaster Corps, cross-referencing Colonel Fitzwilliam's movements and expenditures. What he discovered shocked him. Fitzwilliam had systematically falsified reports claiming reimbursement for Indian campaigns that never occurred, pocketing federal funds meant for supplies and soldier wages. The burning of the mining camp had been an attempt to cover his tracks, to eliminate witnesses who might have testified about his corruption. Armed with this evidence, John Thornton traveled to Washington and presented his findings to the Judge Advocate General's office. The resulting court-martial was sensational. Colonel Fitzwilliam was found guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was dishonorably discharged, stripped of his pension, and sentenced to 10 years in military prison. John wrote to Lillian with the news. Her response was brief. "Thank you. It does not bring him back, but at least his name is cleared. That is something." Years passed. Lillian grew older, her hair going gray, her limp becoming more pronounced in cold weather. The world changed around her. Reservations were established, and dissolved treaties were made and broken. The frontier gradually became less wild. But some things did not change. Lillian still touched her bracelet every night, still whispered Chayton's name in darkness, still kept his memory alive by living the life he had given her, by helping people, by refusing to let the world convince her that their love had been wrong. 20 years after Chayton's death, Lillian received an unexpected visitor, a young Lakota man named Two Hawks, who said he was Chayton's nephew. He brought a piece of birch bark covered in precise markings, a map, and beside it a drawing of a woman with a beaded bracelet on her wrist. He made this before he died. Two Hawks explained. "Gave it to my father with instructions. Find the woman with the bracelet. Tell her she was not forgotten." Lillian wept as she held that precious artifact, learning that Chayton had thought of her at the end, had memorialized her, had wanted her to know she mattered to his family. Lillian lived another 17 years after Two Hawks' visit, working almost until the day she died at age 70. She passed quietly in her sleep, surrounded by students and colleagues, and she was buried in a small cemetery overlooking the mountains under a simple stone that read, "Lillian Margaret Harrow, 1853-1923, nurse writer, witness beloved wife of Chayton Lakota." The bracelet was buried with her. But before the coffin was closed, one of her former students, a Cree woman named Sarah, who had become a doctor herself, placed something else inside a small birch bark map showing the route from a trap in Montana to freedom in Canada, and the careful drawing of a woman who had been loved. The story of Lillian Thornton and Chayton became over the decades something of a legend in certain circles. It was taught in nursing schools as an example of courage. It was cited in debates about Indigenous rights and interracial marriage. It was whispered about in saloons and parlors, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disapproval, but always with awed recognition, and these two people had defied an entire world that wanted them dead, and they had in their own way, for their own brief time, won. The trap where Lillian had been caught was found years later and removed. The land where the mining camp had stood was gradually reclaimed by forest. The river ford where Chayton had made his stand became just another unmarked crossing. But in a small clinic in Fort McLeod, and in the stories told by Two Hawks and his children and his children's children, the memory persisted. Two people from different worlds, who should have been enemies, who had been given every reason to hate and fear each other, had instead chosen something harder and braver. They had chosen love and partnership and mutual respect. They had chosen to see each other as human beings, whole and complicated and worthy of honor. And though the world had punished them for that choice, though it had burned and hunted and killed to prevent that kind of seeing, it had not succeeded in erasing what they had shared. Their story survived. Their love survived. That was the legacy Lillian and Chayton left behind. Not a kingdom, not a fortune, not even a long life together. Just a story. Just a truth witnessed and recorded and passed down. Just the knowledge that once on the harsh frontier of 1876, a trapped girl and a warrior had found each other, had recognized each other's worth, and had loved each other with a fierceness that even death could not diminish. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the wind moves through the pines, when the light slants gold across the mountains, sometimes that is enough. Sometimes a story is all we need to remember that we are capable of more than we know, that love is not a weakness, but a form of courage, and that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. We are witnessed. We are remembered. We are loved. And that love, fragile and mortal and impossibly brave, is the thread that connects us all, across time, across culture, across every boundary that seeks to divide us. It is the thing that makes us human. It is the thing that allows us to endure. It is the thing that in the end might just save us. If we are wise enough to honor it, if we are brave enough to fight for it, if we are stubborn enough to refuse to let the world convince us that it does not matter. Lillian and Chayton knew this. They lived it, and they died knowing it. And their story, this improbable, tragic, beautiful story, stands as testament. Love matters. Truth matters. Seeing each other really seeing without the blinders of prejudice or fear matters. And sometimes, that is the only thing that does.